sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this panel aptly named A Living Nightmare, the Political and Humanitarian Crisis in Sudan. Since April 2023, the war, primarily between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, has led to untold horrors for Sudan's people, from atrocities such as the use of rape as a weapon of war, the use of starvation as a weapon of war, and genocide, particularly in Sudan's western region. This war on civilians has seen the situation in Sudan quickly become the world's worst humanitarian crisis, the world's largest hunger crisis, the world's largest displacement crisis, and the world's largest protection crisis. The international response to the war in Sudan has been, particularly considering the scale, little more than disappointing, some might say negligent. Even before the US's aid freeze, funding commitments were pitifully low, and the aid industry has been slow to recognize and support the work of mutual aid groups, such as the Nobel Prize-nominated volunteer-led emergency response rooms. Now, particularly after the cruel deployment of the immediate freeze by the US government, the largest humanitarian donor in Sudan, Sudanese have been largely left to fend for themselves. As we speak, Zamzam IDP camp in North Darfur, where famine was declared last year, is being attacked by the rapid support forces in continuation of the genocide of 20 years ago, led by the Janjaweed and Bashir's government. The people there have no protective wedge between them and their attackers. So it's a good time to have a discussion such as this, and I have with me today an esteemed panel who would address some of these challenges facing Sudan. To my left, we have Ali Yusuf Ahmed Abdel Sharif, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Sudan, based in Port Sudan. We have Mirjana Spoljaric, the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross. We have Ted Sheiban, the Deputy Executive Director for Humanitarian Action and Supply Operations. It's a very long title, Ted. United Nations Children Fund. And we have Dr. Fólker, the Senior Distinguished Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, or SWP. So I'm going to quickly start with you, Mirjana. Can you set the scene for us, for those of us who may not be as familiar with the war in Sudan? What are some of the acute humanitarian needs that you're hearing from your team on the ground?
What you see in Sudan is a definition of the relevance of the rules in war, and visualizes why war cannot be a lawless space. You have 12 million, more than 12 million, Filippo can support that, displaced people. Large-scale destruction of civilian infrastructure. You have a lot of civilian casualties. We provide medical assistance amongst other places in Atbara. We see the rising number in war wounded. We see the high numbers of women and children that have been abducted, sexually abused, violated. These are war crimes. Now, we don't prevent war, but what we say is you cannot allow the standards to be lowered to such levels, because it drives insecurity in the entire region, and it drives the cost of war to levels, both humanly and economically, that will make it increasingly impossible to return to anything that will allow for de-escalation and long-term stability. We need to start by calling on the parties to come back to what they have written down in the Jeddah Agreement, which is compliance with international humanitarian law. It's the only way to de-escalate in a situation like Sudan at the moment, and the obligations are the same for all weapon bearers, be they state actors or non-state actors.
And Ted, if I can turn to you, how can the international community scale up the humanitarian efforts to address the high rates of severe malnutrition and famine, and collapsing health systems across the country, disease outbreaks, as well as mass displacement? What impact also would a reduction of US foreign assistance have on Sudan's humanitarian emergency?
First, let me add to the previous response and say that the largest humanitarian catastrophe that we have in the world today is Sudan. Almost 9 million people are facing famine-like conditions. In certain places, famine has been identified. That's emergency or catastrophic levels of food insecurity. Last year, we've had an unprecedented number of children, 500,000 children admitted for treatment against severe acute malnutrition. If you don't get that treatment, you got a 50% chance of dying. So we're talking about a phenomenal scale of a humanitarian crisis. And we all need to work together to address that crisis. Firstly is access. And the RSF needs to give us access. There was a 41-truck convoy that was held for 6 weeks on its way from Chad to Zamzam camp. You mentioned Zamzam camp. And it then was not allowed to go through because we were told the civilians had left Zamzam. We need access cross-line, cross-border, into all areas of Sudan. We're very glad to have the foreign minister here to support us on issues related to bureaucratic impediments and also allow presence throughout the territory, including in Zelinji, including Kadugli, so that we can bear witness to what's going on, monitor the aid, and make sure it gets to the right people. Second, we need funding. The UN appeal of $6 billion for Sudan and neighboring countries is 15% funded. For Sudan itself, it's $4 billion. UNICEF has $1 billion of that, $4 billion, 15% funded. And we need an acceleration of the humanitarian waivers, the return of US funding to be able to support the response. And thirdly, we need an end to the violence. If we can't have a ceasefire, then let's talk about humanitarian pauses, let's talk about corridors, let's talk about periods of tranquility so that we can get to the people who need this assistance.
And actually on that point, I'd like to turn to you. And what do you think, Your Excellency, has been in terms of access, which has been identified as a major constraint by most humanitarian actors? How can the authorities in Port Sudan, persuade those in its that are allied to it on the ground, whether it's the government or militias, etc., to let aid through? How can the government in Port Sudan make aid access much easier than it currently is?
All right, let me start by expressing my thanks and appreciation to the fact that Sudan has featured very well in this international conference, and that I was invited to this conference after a few years of not inviting anybody from the government. And let me also say in front of the colleagues who are representing agencies, UN agencies and ICRC, that we are very happy with what you are doing to us in Sudan. What is happening is not a choice that was made by people who are wise to bring to their country and to their families and to their people what is happening now. This has been imposed on us due to very selfish reasons and agenda of foreign countries who are interested in the Sudan and its resources. So, having said that, we are cooperating in a very, I personally take good effort, meeting with all the heads of the UN missions and also other organizations who are working in the area of providing aid, humanitarian aid to the Sudanese people. And I think using nightmare in the name of this meeting is very accurate, because we are all living in a nightmare because what is happening in the Sudan and the way we are facing serious violations of human rights, and as you have said, abuses and sexual abuses and killing of people, and causing so many people to flee their homes and go to other places. I was a refugee myself. I still, my house is, I don't know if Ted saw my house or not, but I'm out of my house. And many of us, we are suffering. We're having this nightmare. what I can say now is Sudan has availed the government of Sudan has provided 8 entry and corridors to provide humanitarian assistance to various parts of the Sudan, controlled by the government or controlled by the rebel forces. And we have also allowed even airplane lifting of aid to different parts of the Sudan where it is difficult to access the needy people through roads. So I think the government of Sudan did its utmost to allow the international organizations and non-governmental organizations to work in Sudan. There are difficulties because we are in a situation of war. There may be some difficulties in getting some, permissions to move to some places for security reasons or whatever. But generally speaking, I think, having met almost all the senior officials who came from various organizations, we have minimized the number of issues pertaining to access.
And Dr. Pertis, if I can turn to you, I think it's important to highlight not just the access constraints in terms of providing aid, but also in providing protection. The protection of civilians is a huge issue in Sudan right now. What measures can be taken to get some level of protection for civilians in the country, in particular women and youth and targeted groups? And how can the International Criminal Court's investigation into war crimes in Sudan be supported to pave the way for accountability, particularly in light of the US's recent sanctions on the court?
Well, thanks, Khulud. I think we have to make clear that the suffering and the protection crisis in Sudan will not end as long as the fighting goes on. So it's not a natural disaster. It's a human-made it's a man-made crisis here. Whether we speak about sexual violence, whether we speak about starvation, no one in Sudan would have to starve. There wouldn't have to be famine in the camps in Darfur or in other places. It is all man-made. So for me, the priority is still to first have a ceasefire or cessation of violence. And we don't see any intention on the warring parties to stop. They both have an interest to continue. The SAF is basically on a go. They are making advances, so they don't see any reason to stop. And the RSF is probably still trying to regain hold of some of the territory which they lost. And there is support from outside. So as long as warring parties have an interest to continue fighting and have the resources to continue fighting, they will not stop doing that. And therefore we have to speak not only about ICC, which I support. I hope they survive the next American president. The ICC is doing great things in order to prepare for accountability. They cannot achieve accountability today, but they have to prepare for it. But without pressure on neighboring countries or countries of interest that are supporting the war in Sudan, I fear it will not end. I don't see the international will right now. So I think we have a multi-level game here. Of course, the humanitarian efforts need to continue, and that's about the humans, that's about the people in Sudan, so it's essential. Of course, the ceasefire talks under the auspices of the US and Saudi Arabia have to continue, and I would wish that the government of Sudan would accept to go there next time there is an invitation for everybody to come. But we also need to bring what I call the countries of interest together, who obviously United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Iran, Russia, and others are pursuing their interests in Sudan at the expense of the population. We need to find out. I don't think their interests are incompatible, but they shouldn't fight at the expense of the Sudanese population for their interests.
Thank you. And now I'd like to call on Filippo Grandi, the Executive Director of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees.
Sorry. A lot has been said. A few comments. First, it is very interesting. I've been in all these years in so many meetings on Sudan. And every time, and rightly so, I hear this is the biggest humanitarian catastrophe on earth. And yet, we hear very little about Sudan. I think we need to reflect on that. One point, last year I visited Sudan twice. I went to Port Sudan and I went to White Nile entering from South Sudan. And one thing that I impressed on, you were not yet the minister at that point, I impressed on especially the military leadership is it is important to allow international media to cover this war. Because if they cannot, and they're still very restricted, we will not make it known. And I understand that in a war, this is always sensitive, but I think it is important. If we want to mobilize the resources that we need that visibility that is lacking. There's many other reasons why this is not a visible crisis. There's many other reasons linked to the very uneven standards of the international community when it comes to conflicts. Some are high visibility, some are not. This is not. But we need to try to raise that visibility. The second, I would agree with Fölker so much. It is important to move from the mindset of military victory to a mindset of making peace. This is, if nothing else, what I hear from the millions of refugees that are going back. We're not going back to Sudan if there is no end to the hostility. At least a ceasefire. I understand that this, not unanimously agreed conference of yesterday or today in Addis made another appeal for a Ramadan-linked ceasefire. I hope that is heeded. And let me also say that meanwhile, this access issue, and I had a word with the minister before, needs to be tackled. The problem is often that even if the pronouncement on access are done at the high level, they don't percolate down to the local level where the difficulties are very sensitive. Third, don't forget the important issue that of the neighbors. I have to speak here as the High Commissioner for Refugees. The neighbors are impacted tremendously. Think of Chad, think of South Sudan, where hundreds of people arrive every day so long after the beginning of the war in countries that are very fragile and where the arrival of refugees increases the fragility of all the neighboring countries, especially these two. There's 3.5 million people that have fled the country, in addition to the millions displaced inside. And I hate to say this, and I've been accused of blackmailing Europe, but if the humanitarian response continues to be very poor inside Sudan and outside in terms of financial support, please, nobody should be surprised if we start seeing secondary movement of people going to North Africa, we already see it, and even trying to get to Europe. This is not a blackmail, this is the reality that we observe on the ground. And with the freeze of US aid, we are, like Ted said, negotiating these waivers, and I'm glad that at least in our case many of the waivers concern the situation of Sudan, but we're negotiating how to spend the money. But that makes the situation even more complex from the humanitarian point of view. So I hope that this important initiative of the Munich Security Conference will help us carry the voice far away on this important issue.
Thank you very much, Filippo. Your Excellency, I'd like to turn to you again. Dr. Purtis made a very pertinent comment, which is that unless there is a ceasefire, unless this war ends, much of the humanitarian issues that we're seeing will not cease. And he also rightly said that last time there was international attention on the mediation processes, the Sudanese armed forces didn't come, but the RSF did come. How do you see, what lessons can you draw from those unsuccessful mediations where the SAF wasn't able to come? And what will it take to get SAF to the table?
Well, I draw very important lessons. Lesson number one, we had the Jeddah process. And you have mentioned the Jeddah process. What happened? the government of Sudan accepted a ceasefire, and there was agreement that the RSF forces should leave the civilian sort of buildings and whatever. All what was asked from them was not done. And what happened is, because of the ceasefire, these forces moved to other parts of Sudan, and they occupied Jazeera, and did in Jazeera what they did. They, as I said, unprecedented violations of human rights. And there was no army in the areas where these militias were killing people, raping women, killing children. This is the outcome of the Jeddah process. What happened? We were invited to the Geneva conference based on the Jeddah. They said this is the same process, the Jeddah process. And we said, if this is the Jeddah process continuation, then start by asking the militia to implement what was agreed in Jeddah. Because if it is Jeddah, then you have to comply. Then we will go and see where we take it from there. And then also in Geneva, a country that is supporting the RSF was invited as a facilitator. Without the support that these rebel militias get, there would not be any war in the Sudan. So what do you expect? That the government will go to Geneva to have another catastrophe like the Jeddah outcome? So we refuse to attend. But if there are serious efforts and there is commitment, and before that there is pressure on the government of the country that is providing modern weapons, and this was certified by the UN, by UN resolution, by a UN commission that is responsible for preventing weapons from entering into Sudan, into Darfur. So if you don't put enough pressure, if the international community doesn't, you know, in our language we have a saying that if you see the elephant, if you want to kill the elephant, don't go and hit the shadow of the elephant. You go to the elephant. I don't know if it is very well, you know it. عينك في الفيل تضع في ظله. The elephant is the country that is providing weapons and all and ammunition and food and everything to the rebels. We allowed the Adri crossing. We allowed it. We know very well that this is very close to Umgeras airport, and the planes that come from the country concerned to this airport carrying weapons and tanks and everything, it goes through Adri. But still, because of the pressure put by the...
Allow me to push you on this point. When the border at Adre was closed, weapons were still coming through. So the Adre opening did not affect the amount of weapons.
Exactly, but that's why we agreed to...
But it did affect the amount of aid that was able to come through. So can you see how, for example, the access constraints that are being talked about are used as...
Just showing you that we were very, very understanding to the needs of...
Can I press you to answer the question, what will it take to get SAF to the table?
This is what I told you, to put pressure
on
the country.
Aside from pressure on the UAE.
If you do that, the war will stop.
Dr. Pattis, what do you think about these remarks? Because obviously the war is fought by two sides, not just one, and both warring parties have shown, for example, a lack of, alacrity in coming to the table. We have seen that the arms embargo has been infringed upon, chiefly by the RSF, but also by the Sudanese Armed Forces, which is operating bombing campaigns, sometimes using 1,000-pound bombs in parts of Darfur. So how do you think, that kind of climate around embargoes and also around recent sanctions, particularly on UAE companies, might have an impact on the course of this war?
Well, you're right, of course. I mean, barrel bombing has been a very, very sad tradition in Sudan from former Sudanese wars against South Sudan, or what is South Sudan now, or against the rebels that are now fighting actually with the government or with the SAF. And it's happening again. I guess I agree on almost everything with the minister, what he said about the RSF, but I disagree a bit on what you said on the government and the SAF. And as a former UN official and as a freelance policy advisor, I could only recommend to the government of Sudan not to close the door if powerful international countries like the United States invite you to come to a conference, even if you said you have tried it before. I hear you. You said you have tried it before, but don't close the door. Go in through the door. Go in through the door and make your point heard. Khulud, your concrete questions, sanctions on individual companies, I don't think it does a lot. No one is going to go against the arms suppliers of the war in Sudan. I don't think the US government, I don't think the European governments, they all have more important interests with the countries that are involved from outside in the war. And what we have seen was the Darfur arms embargo. I mean, this has been in place, theoretically, for many, many years, even before the war. Even when the RSF leader Hemeti and the SAF leader General Burhan ruled together and make a military coup together. I mean, there was an arms embargo and it was ignored. So I don't think it is the sanctions that will do the trick. It is to address, and I would wish it to be from Washington, the countries that have a major interest in the Sudan, the external countries, and that are supporting warring parties, bring them to the table and say, look, what does it take? You want port access? You want agricultural lands? What does it take to address your concerns? And I'm sure the government of Sudan or any future government of Sudan would be happy to talk to them.
And Ted, very briefly, we should probably discuss this issue of partition. We've been a lot of people have been warning that the country is heading towards partition, but in many ways it's already de facto split. You have different aid regimes, you have different currencies, and soon enough perhaps even different governments. How does UNICEF, from an operational standpoint, plan to engage with this reality on the ground?
Look, I mean, as Filippo has said, we are dealing with the largest crisis in the world that people are not addressing. And the last thing any of us need is that the territorial integrity of Sudan is weakened. We all know what happened in Somalia during the 1990s. It took 25 years to get back to a place where people could start thinking about the future again, and none of us want that for Sudan. So I think it's essential that there's a political process that people respect. They respect their commitments as part of that political process and move forward. I think it's also critically important that humanitarian assistance is allowed to reach people in need. And, you know, we do it in a way that respects the sovereignty of Sudan. And that's why we're calling for the access to be allowed. That's why we're calling for international humanitarian law to be respected.
And on that, Mariana, let me come to you. We've seen, you know, grievous contravention of IHL by both warring parties in terms of the atrocity violence, the summary executions, often caught on camera, you know, because those who commit these crimes don't fear any consequences. How can IHL, international humanitarian law, be prioritized in such a context where a ceasefire is not in sight and, frankly, there aren't very good or very effective enforcement mechanisms for IHL?
We were, to a certain extent, involved in the run-up to the Jeddah Agreement in various forms, as we normally are in our actions on the ground and interactions with the warring parties in any conflict in the world. There's the line that I picked up in that run-up process. It doesn't come from me, but I use it often. There are 100 steps to peace, and the first are always humanitarian. And you see it in Sudan.
Can you repeat that?
there are 100 steps to peace, and the first ones are always humanitarian. What is enshrined in the Jeddah Agreement is not transactional per se. It's a visualization of the obligations that the parties have, irrespective of whether they have written it down in the Jeddah Agreement or not, because it contains the fundamental obligations that they are bound by. We are treating people in our medical facility in Atbara that have traveled for 10 days because there's hardly any functioning medical facility in the country. Protecting medical facilities is a legal obligation. Raping women and children is a war crime. There's never a justification for it under any rule, under any military strategy. Any party is bound by these rules. Now, if you don't have the means to fund humanitarian assistance, then stop the killing. That's the best way of reducing humanitarian pressures and the budgetary pressures, especially on Western countries. Nobody fights alone. No state actor is ever alone in a conflict. And ceasefire agreements don't come into force without political engagement and without political pressures of all that can potentially have an influence. And again, we call on the parties to respect our child, irrespectively of what the other does. We remind them confidentially of their obligations. But there is a collective responsibility of the international community to get out of their way to stop the escalation of conflicts, especially conflicts like we see now in the Horn of Africa. We classify 120 armed conflicts, more than that even. And we see an intensification of escalations and scale when technological means provide the possibility for large-scale destructions, the recovery cost of which the international community is beyond being able to absorb. So our conclusion is the parties have to work with whoever they can to respect the law as a first means to de-escalate. Whether you call it the Jeddah Agreement or not, what is written in it is what needs to be realized by everyone. It's our responsibility and of every state leader. We can't turn away from conflicts like Sudan, and we cannot turn away from the fact that any lowering of the standards of how military operations or armed violence is conducted are going to inform the next conflict.
Thank you. Let's turn to the audience. I'm sure there's some burning questions. We'll go to, keep it brief though, please. As the Dean, then Tirana, then Robbie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is الدين الصافي. I'm the Senior Advisor for the RSF Commander-in-Chief for Peace and Humanitarian Affairs. Thank you for inviting me. And also I'm a delegation member, RSF delegation member in Jeddah, where there is huge something incorrect that I will answer regarding Jeddah. First of all, Jeddah is not an agreement. Jeddah is a declaration.
I'm going to ask you to keep it very brief and to focus on a question, please.
Jeddah is a declaration that everyone should abide by, but when it comes to the agreement, SAF withdraw before the final agreement. And therefore, we were waiting for 1 month for SAF to come back and never showed up. So there was no agreement regarding Jeddah. There was a declaration with no any monitoring mechanisms. And the second Jeddah also, unfortunately, SAF also withdrew. The point why SAF withdrew, because SAF refused to sign on both parties should vacate from the houses and civilian installations. SAF refused. I will repeat, SAF refused to sign on this particular point. That's why he withdrew for the second time. And third, according to the former USAID chief, Samantha Power, 74% of the humanitarian assistance is stuck in Port Sudan due to bureaucratic impediments. And at the same time, there are more than 65% of the Sudanese people live in the RSF-controlled area where SAF deliberately blocked the humanitarian assistance for 23 months. For 23 months, there was no humanitarian assistance apart from the Adre crossing, recent Adre crossing agreement. And by the way, Adre is controlled by the RSF. Adre is not controlled by SAF. And also, what I would like also to stress that there are more than 8 million Sudanese people now starving to death. The majority of them under the RSF control, where SAF bombarding them. In the past 4 months only, there was more than 5,000 civilians killed by the aerial bombardment. So I call upon the world to hold SAF accountable for the random bombardment of the Sudanese people. And also, I call upon the world to step further for the Sudanese people. And I'm happy to see Mr. Fولكر is here. Mr. Fولكر knows clearly who began this war. Who began this war? Because the RSF commander-in-chief called him in the early morning. So,
do you have a question?
No.
Okay, thank you so much, because we need to move on to others who've been waiting as well. Thank you. Tirana, please. Sure, you can get a mic.
Hi, Tirana Hassan from Human Rights Watch. I guess it's very encouraging to hear that there's a call from RSF representatives for accountability for crimes that have been committed, because the same level of accountability will be required from all parties to this conflict. So with that in mind, and my question is, what is the plan to start to accelerate the protection of civilians? We are talking about humanitarian aid, which is just the essence of human survival. But what is the concrete plan for the protection of the civilians who are trapped, who we clearly know from what has been said today, and for those of us that have been documenting, are not receiving humanitarian assistance, that the blockages have been not just from the SAF, but also from the RSF. So could you maybe elaborate on that? And also, in particular, the rather alarming reports that have re-emerged, with the last reports were in 2016, about the use of chemical weapons in this conflict, which has been a very alarming sort of descent into what we thought was already a very low point in this war.
Thank you very much. Robbie?
Hey, Robbie Grammer here for the Minister. Can you just clarify where the talks are on the Russian negotiations with Russia for establishing a naval base in the Red Sea? And talk a bit about your time in Moscow. And also, since there's been an elephant in the room, sometimes vaguely alluded to, what would your message be to the United Arab Emirates and also to Washington, which, of course, views the UAE as an important partner on this conflict? Thanks.
Okay, Your Excellency, let's come to you first. So we had a question on protection of civilians. What is the Sudanese army or the Sudanese government doing to ensure the protection of civilians? Do you have a comment on the allegations of SAF using chemical weapons? And Robbie's question around the Russian base, of course, who just came from Moscow. Over to you.
On the issue of protection of civilians, the government has passed on to the Security Council and to the United Nations the government's plan for civilian protection. And it conforms with all the international rules and regulations on protecting human beings and protecting civilians. So we have shown our commitment to international.
Can you give us a sense of what that plan looks like?
It looks like, as I said, we are responsible for the protection of civilians where the civilians are under our protection. But you cannot say why you are not protecting civilians in a Jazeera, for example, because of the atrocities that were committed. Because we are not present there. This is a war. It is not a It's not a game. You should ask those who are responsible for the violations, first of all, why they committed these atrocities, and now they are talking about, we're talking about peace, and you said to partition, or I don't know. So what I want you to understand is, we want to see peace in our country. This is our country. It is not the country of somebody else. We were born in the Sudan, we lived in the Sudan, and the people who are having these violations committed against are our families, our brothers and sisters, and I don't know, sometimes I have a feeling that some people don't know Sudan very well and don't know what happened in the Sudan. That's why sometimes you hear something which looks a little bit strange, that we are not preventing our own people from having food. We are, as I said, we have allowed access to all parts of Sudan. We have not made any, there is no concrete evidence of violations made by the Sudanese army, despite the fact that in every war, because of the fact that this is a war, you will always have some victims of a war without intention. But in our war in the Sudan, you have a lot of investigative reports and so on about violations that are committed by the RSF, and it was intended to be committed to frighten people and to force what they want to do in the Sudan. I again really hope that we should not take what is happening in the Sudan as if it's a war between two countries or two. It is one country. It is the institutional army of the Sudan, the Sudanese armed forces, that is fighting a militia that was formed. We all know the history of RSF and how it continued, and somebody said they participated in the coup against Bashir and so on. So the background, it explains what is happening. What I want you to try to help us do is, and now I am telling you this, is that we want to see peace in our country. We want to see democracy in our country. But we want those who want to help us to be genuine, to come forward. Now we have 2 or 3 peace initiatives to have peace in the Sudan.
Excellency, I'm sorry.
And we have accepted.
I don't mean to cut you off, but can we get to Tirana's second question on chemical weapons? How does this fit into it?
There were no chemical. How can you talk about chemical weapons without providing concrete evidence? Just to say there was. We don't have chemical weapons. Where do we get it from, chemical weapons?
The South and we are members of chemical weapons before, particularly in 2016 and before that in 2008. So the SAF does have a history of using chemical weapons, which is why such claims are, of course, believable. So your response is?
No, I tell you, the army did not use chemical weapons, the Sudanese army. So if somebody accuses us of using chemical weapons, then prove it.
Okay, that's something the State Department should have to answer for then.
The State Department or any department.
In terms of Robbie's question about the Russian base, you just came from Moscow, and while there, you responded to a Russian journalist saying that the deal was pretty much almost done. But since then, I think you've backtracked.
What I said is this agreement. They thought that I went there to negotiate an agreement with the Russians to have a base in the Red Sea. What I said is we did not talk about any base for the Russians in the Red Sea. I said this has been agreed before. There was agreement on this, which was signed by the government of Sudan and by the Russian government. This is something that was done. We did. It was not open. We did not discuss it. the agreement needed ratification. It was not ratified in Sudan. So the agreement is there. I cannot deny that there is an agreement, or there was an agreement. And I cannot talk about, I did not talk about the agreement with the Russians. This is what I said. They said you had differences. I said, we didn't talk about it. How can we have differences about something we did not discuss? There is agreement? Yes, there is agreement. I did not make the agreement. I did not sign it.
Okay, thank you. Before we get to another round, I just very quickly want to turn to the rest of the panel, just because Tirana picked up on a very important point. But the protection of civilians is something that is central to the needed required response on Sudan. What can be done given the constraints at the Security Council, given the constraints on the ground? Just very briefly, Dr. Pertis, we'll turn to you first.
Well, thank you, Khulud. Probably to set two things straight. When I spoke about a coup, with all due respect, Mr. Minister, I didn't speak about the coup against Bashir. I spoke about the coup against the Hamdok government, which was sort of co-authored by the RSF and the SAF. And Mr. Safi, yes, I spoke about barrel bombs, and I know the RSF has no air force, but the kids, the children that are starving in Zamzam camp or in Al-Fashir, they are not starving because of the bombings, they are starving because of the siege which the RSF is laying on these places. I think we have to be honest here, and I would wish that the representatives of warring parties would take some responsibility for what is happening under their watch. Unfortunately, I think we cannot rely on the Security Council right now. We have seen that with a resolution that had 14 votes for a humanitarian ceasefire in Sudan and 1 veto, so the Security Council is effectively blocked. What we need here, I think, is, well, a coalition of the reasonable states who would come together in the General Assembly, if it is UN action, or would come together under the auspices of the African Union, which is also rejected by some of the actors on the ground in Sudan, and get both civilians from all sides and get the militaries in different rounds, of course, to talk to one another. And very much along the lines of Mirjana, start with doing that what you are obliged to in the first place, that is respecting international humanitarian law, and then cease the fighting. And then society will probably take over. Then things happen. If parents don't have to be afraid that their kids will be killed on the way to school, if people can go to the markets again, I think we get a societal dynamic, as we have had so often in Sudan, where civilians can take over.
And Ted and Marianne, I'm going to briefly come to you. The minister has said that there is a Government of Sudan Protection of Civilians plan. Have either of you come across it? Do you have any idea of how you'd operationalize such a plan or help in setting one up?
What we have to avoid is humanitarian assistance and specific access questions from becoming a distraction. There's no humanitarian assistance in meaningful ways happening when there's not enough political pressure coming from those who have the influence and the means. You cannot de-link de-escalation for humanitarian means and the better respect of IHL from where the prioritization of this question lies in those who can have an impact on the ground. And it's, as I said, it's a number of governments across the globe. It's not necessarily the neighbors. It could be anyone that is today not picking up the phone and calling their allies to tell them that they not accept anymore the continued violation of the law because it's creating fallouts that are, spreading insecurity across regions and across the globe. As long as people are prevented from accessing health systems because health systems collapse in violation of the law, people will continue to be driven out of their countries and towards Europe. Radicalization will continue to increase. Denouncing your enemy is not the solution. State leaders have to adopt the approach that it is their primary responsibility to convince their allies to protect civilians. And only when this agreement is revived again, that is enshrined in the Geneva Conventions that were ratified by all states, will we see a de-escalation and a better protection of civilians.
Ted, over to you. Have you seen this plan, and is UNICEF thinking about how to operationalize such a plan?
In 2024, there was some 2,000 grave violations against children, and sadly, the top grave violation was killing and maiming of children. If we can't have a ceasefire, then we call on all that are fighting to do everything possible to protect civilian and civilian infrastructure. That's an average of 3 children each day that's dying. I'm not talking about the famine, I'm talking about the violence that is in the country. And yes, we are engaging with the government. We're speaking to the RSF about how to minimize those casualties. Children must be protected. And this is something with the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict that we continue to press and engage on. But ultimately, obviously, what we need is a ceasefire and a political solution and a way forward that gives a peaceful, prosperous Sudan.
But isn't part of the problem that we keep linking the protection of civilians and the provision of humanitarian aid to a ceasefire that, quite frankly, we know is not coming? Isn't it about time we rethought how we think about particularly aid and the protection of civilians away from a ceasefire that won't come?
I don't think it's an and, or an either-or, rather. I think it's an and. I think you need to speak about what you can do in the short term, and I agree with you, you shouldn't wait for a ceasefire, which is why IHL is so important, which is why the dialogue we're having about how to protect children is so important. And you need to fight for a ceasefire in a political way forward. So it's an and, not an either-or.
Do you have time for a brief round? Yes, please, sir.
Hi. My name is Arif Hussain. I'm Chief Economist for the World Food Program. So I started my work 20 plus years ago during the first Darfur crisis. And one thing which was really special about that crisis, if I can put it that way, was that the whole world knew about it. People like George Clooney, others, they made it their cause. Today, it is maybe 5 times worse than what it was then. But there is no real traction. I think that's to me, point number 1. The second point I want to just clarify is that, you know, as humanitarians, whether UNICEF, ourselves, HCR, you need 2 things, always, if you want to save lives. You need regular access to people who are in need of assistance, and you need money to provide that assistance. If you have all the access and no money, doesn't work. If you have all the money and no access, still doesn't work. And I think right now in Sudan, we are experiencing problems on both sides, and this is why we have the biggest crisis. So it's not that we cannot deal with it or we cannot handle that. It is because of these major constraints that there are women, children, and men dying on our watch.
Thank you. I completely agree. The lady behind you.
Hello, Tawakkul Karaman from Yemen, Nobel Peace Prize. I think, or I believe that what is happening in Sudan now is kind of punishment against Sudanese because they dare to make a peaceful revolution and they dare to dream for democracy, dignity, and freedom. And unfortunately, that, you know, the international community from the beginning, they didn't really support the revolution in Sudan. So what Sudan needs now, it needs really to be free from the RSF militia. All of you talk about their crimes, I will not repeat, but the militia who really collapsed this country, who raped people, who make all that war crimes and still, continue their war crimes in Sudan should be trialed, should be removed, should be stopped. And unfortunately, there is no real international support for Sudanese, people to stop this, militia, especially with the support from the regional countries who has, who use their wealth to destroy countries because they are afraid from democracy. So when we talk about Sudan, we have to know why people are paying this very high price. I believe that with all that big, price that Sudanese, paying now, that Sudanese people will prevail. We will see the victory of Sudanese people very soon. They didn't give up. They still in their struggle for freedom and democracy. And what is happening now, it's kind of facing this militia for democracy and for freedom. So I don't have any doubt that Sudanese people will prevail in this battle. My question to Minister, so what is really your vision for Sudan free from militia and Sudan a real democratic country, to be real democratic country? Because what is Sudanese is now paying for is for a real democratic Sudan in the future.
Thank you. We'll take one more before we go back to the panel. Yes, the gentleman at the back.
Okay, thank you for giving me a chance. I have to also add another point rather than the people mentioned, that the issue of the mercenaries, which is, I think, very vital in prolonging this war. The militia, the RSF, they deployed mercenaries all over Africa. More than 50 countries, nationals are participating in the war, and they have been paid and mobilized by the regional actors, especially UAE, and then their attempt is to build their empire starting from Sudan. So the militia is really imposing a real threat, not to Sudan only, but to all the region, because there are many fragile countries in the region, and the phenomena of the militia, which started in Sudan, will going to be a real threat to the stability in the region. So the militia played a real role in introducing this new phenomena, which is going to affect the security in the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It is, of course, worth noting that the Janjaweed militia, which later became the RSF, was itself created by the security state in Sudan, of which the Sudanese Armed Forces is a part, and the Sudanese Armed Forces to this day is creating militias again and supporting militias actually across the country. So this is broader than just one entity being a militia. It's the fact that militias have been used across Sudan's history, particularly by the Sudanese Armed Forces, to fight its wars in the periphery. So it's a very good point that you bring up. And I want to take this back to the panel, particularly Tawakkul Karman's question of what is the appetite for democracy now within Sudan? What is the government's view? What is SAF's view about bringing about democracy to Sudan?
Well, I think there is a roadmap that was made public recently, starting with ending the war and going to a transitional government from 1 year to 3 years with a civilian led government, prime minister and ministers from technocrats, not members of any parties or any political groups. And towards the end of the transitional period, there will be free and fair elections, and the people of Sudan will say their because this is normally if you want to talk about democracy, it means that the people should have the right to say who should rule them. Of course, even before that, they should say how they want to be ruled. And I think this roadmap is it was made public, and it is based on this. And there was even talk about the possibility for those who are now fighting to throw the arms and come and join the efforts of the rest of the Sudanese people in trying to achieve peace and development and reconstruction of the country. Actually, when we talk about Sudan now, it's very different from what it was before this war. And it is enough for me to say that the National Museum of Sudan was burned with all the history of Sudan, 6 or 7 years back. It was burned. You know, the place where we are keeping our records also for over 100 years, it was burned. It's called National Archives. It was burned, and all the documents were burned. So there is something that we as Sudanese, and I'm telling you, we don't understand what is happening. So somebody is trying to eliminate something called Sudanese people and Sudan. We honestly, now I speak as an ordinary Sudanese. I don't understand what is happening, why this is happening, and who is doing that. It is not the army, it is the RSF. Why are they burning the National Museum and stealing all the
So
you know, the history of Sudan is being destroyed.
Not to cut you off, but we're running out of time. So would you say that then justice and accountability will be central to the path towards democracy, and would the Sudanese armed forces commit to seeking full accountability, including for crimes committed by its allied militias, in the hope of getting to that democracy that Tawakkul spoke about?
Yeah, I said we as Sudanese, we want to have democracy in our country. And I told you there is a roadmap for this. End the war, we want to end the war, and after ending the war, we will move on what I have just said, a transitional government and elections by the people.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to turn to you. 1 minute each, please. Dr. Pertis, go ahead. Any reflections?
I mean, one word on militias and one on democracy or transition to civilian rule. Both sides are using militias. And I understand, Minister, correct me if I'm wrong, that's a militia that has been responsible for the atrocities in Al Jazeera has changed side and is now fighting on the government side. But it's exactly the same leader, some Mr. Kikl, who was a bandit, who then joined the RSF and now joins the SAF. And he's continuing the same ways. And there are a lot of militias fighting on the government side or on the SAF side, and of course the RSF is a militia, but it is a militia that has been empowered under the dual rule of the SAF and the RSF over the last couple of years. So I don't think we could say there was something alien which came as a militia with alien people. Yes, they recruited outside, but the majority of them are Sudanese, and in some way these Sudanese, as much as all others, have to be part of a country together. You say it doesn't make sense to sit together with them at that point. But let me remind you, when you made peace eventually with South Sudan, it was over an agreement between the two sides, and only after that there were elections, after an agreement. And I think it has to be the same. Have an agreement to make peace, to stop the fighting, to make peace, and then get into a transition process and have elections. But if you have elections under a military government, I fear you will not reach the entire country.
Ted, any last reflections?
I mean, look, I was in Darfur 20 years ago. I lived in Sudan. It's a beautiful place. And I think the difference, you mentioned the periphery. Back then, it was the periphery that was getting destroyed. Now it's the whole country that's getting destroyed. And this is in no one's interest. It's not in the interest of any Sudanese. It's not in the interest of the countries, the so-called interested parties that are fueling the conflict. And we all need to step back. We need to step back. There needs to be a joined-up process, a roadmap that moves forward, but it has to be inclusive. I mean, peace is made among people who fight each other. And there has to be a way that puts the citizens at the center, the children at the center of everyone's concern.
Marianne, the last word to you.
Respect for IHL is a primary responsibility for states. And it's also a responsibility for states to ensure respect for IHL. But no person who controls weapons bearers is free from the same obligations to respect the rights of civilians, to protect civilian infrastructure in times of violence and the conduct of hostilities. We have to embrace the fact that if you continue a conflict beyond the point of no return, it becomes very dangerous for the whole region, for the whole world. We hear on Sudan, what we hear on other regions where conflicts are happening, that the devastation we see today is so much more complete than what we saw in the same places 20 years ago. Where are we trending? It is the moment to acknowledge that we need political power, political will, and political influence to de-escalate, and it has to happen yesterday and not tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. And just one final note from me, that especially with the funding freeze from USAID, we're seeing a lot of communal kitchens, in particular Khartoum, but elsewhere, closed down. And you can support some of them by going to SudanSolidarityCollective.org or the mutualaidsudan.org to donate. In the meantime, please thank my guests for the enlightening interventions. Thank you.